Hi, my loves. Today's video is going to be discussing a rather deep topic that is dear to my heart, but I think is really important. And I think a lot of people, are starting to become more and more aware of it and wanting to talk about it. And it's all about how spiritual and religious communities can prop up narcissistic abusers and enable abuse. A lot of you have experienced these things, and I want to advocate for you and let you know that you're not alone, you're not crazy. These things do happen, and it's also something to be aware of if you are, a part of any spiritual, religious organization. I mean, this kind of thing can happen at work too, but these specific things that I'm talking about are specific to organizations that preach certain values that are inherently good. They come from a well-intended place, but they can lock victims in cycles of abuse, and they can actually shelter people who are perpetrating abuse on other people, especially people in positions of leadership and power. So having this awareness of how these things work can help everybody in an organization be aware of what could actually be happening and maybe be able to see some red flags and some warning signs if they're present, because it's a very slippery thing. And also this can help educate victims so they don't feel so alone and confused as far as what is happening around them, and can also help educate other people in these groups to not take part in the systemic abuse that can happen in these organizations. Okay, let's dive in. A lot of people seek out comfort and belonging in spiritual or religious organizations, especially after a rough time or during a time of healing. We all as humans have an inherent longing for connection with others and with God. And while community and a deeper connection to spirit are both innately healing, there can also be a really dark side to a lot of these groups. And if we aren't careful, we may end up enduring abuse, manipulation, and control. More and more stories of abuse within these kinds of groups have been surfacing lately. I personally grew up in a non-denominational Christian church, and later on ended up in the spiritual or conscious community. And from what I have seen, the narcissistic folly of human beings is just as prevalent in these spaces as they are in the rest of the world. And oftentimes it is even more so. It is just a few more layers deep. It's often covert. It's actually, they use God and spirit to perpetuate these abuses on people. And it can be hard to see at first. So when individuals are seeking healing and support from people, especially leaders in these kinds of groups, they are extra vulnerable. They are often looking to find their center again, reconnect with God, reconnect with their life again. So they are usually off balance, imbalance, hurting a lot, and are having a hard time finding their own way. Often really wounded individuals, and this is a really vulnerable state. And while there are so many amazing healers and guides and teachers and pastors, people like doing good work in these spaces, there are also a lot of predators. So predators prey on seekers. They prey on the wounded, they prey on the vulnerable, they prey on the bleeding. This is just as true in the animal kingdom as it is in human relationships. When someone has been disconnected from their true self and has sustained deep spiritual injury or loss of direction, loss of source, disconnection, People who have been through these kinds of traumatic experiences understand how overwhelming and disorienting life can be in these situations. And having someone that you can trust is incredibly important. And people in these tender situations are really needing trustworthy guidance to help them, re-regulate themselves and get back into center. Unfortunately, in this state, a person is far more susceptible to manipulation, and predators know this. That is why they seek out wounded individuals. They know that you are not going to trust your intuition as much. They know you are feeling lost. They know you are disoriented. They know you are wounded. They know that you are seeking outside of yourself for guidance. This puts predators in a really good position to be able to catch somebody who is in this fragile state. Cult leaders and politicians know this, and they rely on this as the foundation to extract energy, wealth, and power, sometimes even sex, from unsuspecting seekers. And then not only are leaders prone to narcissistic patterns, but a lot of the followers will also use more conscious or better than collective narratives as a template for their own identity and to cover up their own narcissism. If predatory people are seen amongst a community of do-gooders, then no one is going to expect or suspect the abuse that they commit in private. As we know, it is much easier for a narcissist to instill their own belief system or their own fraudulent identity into the minds and hearts of people who are dissociated, not fully present or embodied, likely due to trauma, and who lack stability in themselves. When a person is seeking fulfillment or validation for their self-worth outside of themselves, a narcissist will use this opening to come into that person's life and have them believe that they hold the key to their wholeness and fulfillment. Then they extract their life force once they are hooked in. Yes, this is literally vampirism. Abusers do not abuse everyone, and they don't do it all the time. That whole like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine him or her ever doing such a thing. They rely on that. It is part of the whole entire tactic. If abuse was that obvious, these people would be ganged up on so fast and kicked out of the community right away. Abusers use their charisma and their self-proclaimed connections with God, with deities, other beings, other people in positions of power, in order to weave this ideal of themselves. So a lot of these types will also tout and chant virtues of honor and integrity and trust and honoring of women and purity and wholeness and all of these really good things to get people to associate them with these characteristics, when often behind closed doors they are participating in lies and betrayal and abuse and a lot of dishonorable things. So this way, when a victim actually speaks out about the abuse that they are experiencing in private with this person, the rest of the people can't comprehend it because their mind has associated this person with all of these other things that they have proclaimed publicly. Usually the only people who are going to believe the victim who speaks out are other victims of abuse. The rest of the cult-like followers are not going to be able to wrap their minds around this person being able to engage in such atrocious behavior. And this is the perfect alibi, and it is exactly how the pack forms an alliance against the victim while propping up and protecting the abuser. Another reason that the pack or the other followers turn against the victim in these scenarios is that they have likely invested a lot of time and energy and devotion, sometimes money, or sometimes other kinds of favors, into this individual. And they've also invested part of their identity into them. It's like when we are loyal to a leader, especially if it has a spiritual significance or political significance, a lot of times like our own identities become attached to this person and what they represent. So to all of a sudden have to see that person as an abuser or as different than what we thought they were, it creates a huge existential disruption. This would make them have to reevaluate their entire belief system and their judge of character and their ability to be able to see and witness the truth, their ability to be duped, their ability to be taken in by a fraud. And this happens to humans all the time. We are all susceptible to it, every single one of us. But waking up to it is so painful. Like, it's terrifying. It's painful. It causes, it causes a huge loss of innocence. It causes us to lose trust, to lose faith, to lose like foundations that we have created for ourselves, like the sense of security that we have formed around us in order to feel safe and secure and like we belong somewhere. When there is a disruption there, it is existentially excruciating. This is when cognitive dissonance kicks in really hard because the mind doesn't like it. The brain and the nervous system are naturally wired to fight against this kind of thing at all costs. And, you see this a lot in political spheres as well, where, someone can be straight up, convicted. There can be proof of criminal behavior of a leader, like in a church or in a cult or a politician, anything like that, and people just they just don't want to believe it. At least the person who is following them, and it's it's extremely frustrating and scary, but it's understandable. Like we are primally wired to resist that at all costs, because what it means can be really frightening. Like we can feel like the whole rug is pulled out from underneath us, and then we have to reassess our entire belief system. And that is one of the hardest things for the human psyche to endure. So for most people, instead of admitting they were wrong and admitting that they have to reevaluate their entire world around them, it is so much easier to blame the victim and to dismiss their claims as false. Okay, now I'm going to get into some dogmatic phrases that we often hear in these communities and organizations that I think are extremely detrimental to victims of abuse. You create your own reality. This message puts the responsibility of abuse onto the victim. Now remember, victims of this particular kind of abuse are conned themselves. They chose to engage with the character that was falsely presented to them at the time. And if they were to have known who this person truly was, they would have walked the other way in a heartbeat. It was not their fault. Now, granted, subconscious beliefs will make a person more prone to these kinds of predators. And if someone, has inherent beliefs of not being worthy enough or not deserving a certain kind of love, then they will tolerate more abuse than what should ever, obviously be tolerated, but they will have a harder time walking away from it because of subconscious beliefs that are held within the system, or because of being entrained in a certain way at a younger age. They won't be able to recognize abuse. But this is absolutely no reason to blame the victim and put the responsibility on them. So this message further isolates and harms the person being harmed while protecting the person causing harm. The next dogmatic concept that is very harmful to victims is victim blaming. So victim is such a bad word in conscious circles. There is such a taboo. Like being a victim has become taboo. So while it's true that a person walking around life with a constant victim complex that cannot find their power in any given situation whatsoever and constantly manipulates from the victim position, which, yes, that happens. Most perpetrators do perpetrate abuse from the victim position. Like that is like what we see in narcissistic personality disorder so much. Yes, like that is problematic. And I think we need to understand the nuances of victim mentality versus actually being a victim of abuse. So yes, living your life from a constant victimized position can lead a person to manipulate and abuse others and feel justified for it. That's not okay. But this is far different than the reaction of a person who has been severely traumatized, betrayed, and abused at the hands of a toxic person. Shaming a person for enduring the most challenging and terrifying and difficult experiences of their lives is further abuse. Victims exist, and the wounds that a narcissistic abuser imposes on their victims are very hard to see to the untrained eye. Usually, people cannot see it unless they have gone through it themselves. The wounds of narcissistic abuse rarely show up physically, but they do appear in the mental and the emotional decline of the person who experienced the abuse. Furthermore, denying a victim their own experience makes it excruciatingly harder for them to heal. Many trauma researchers have shared that when a victim of abuse is believed and supported by their community, that they're actually able to heal rather quickly. On the other hand, when victims of abuse have been denied or shamed or not believed by the community around them, they have a much harder time healing if they ever do. Like they often get stuck, frozen, they isolate further. Some of them even commit suicide. It is important to understand that a victim's ability to heal relies heavily on the community around them, if their friends believe them, if their friends support them. So blaming a victim for what they experienced is one of the most shitty things that a person can do to someone who has just come out of an absolutely atrocious situation. And the rate at which this occurs in spiritual or conscious communities is alarming. I see it all the time, and I endured it myself. Like, it's a mind fuck to go through something so terrible and then to have people that you once trusted or looked up to telling you that, well, it's your fault. You know, you shouldn't be a victim. If a person does not claim their victimhood and validate what happened to them and allow themselves to get angry and pissed and allow themselves to really see what happened, they will not be able to wrap their minds around and actually, have cognition of what they experienced. And that is a very important part of making sure that they don't fall into the same traps in the future. So doing this actually sets a person up to continue to be abused in the same way. And when a person is going through something like that, I'll tell you right away, like suicidal ideation is definitely a part of this experience. Like when you've gone through this, like you're just so fucked, like you can't function properly. So it is actually endangering lives and endangering the spiritual integrity of others to blame them for their own victimhood. So if you're doing that, knock it off. Another dogmatic concept that is harmful is toxic compassion. So this term was new to me. I was always, love is the answer to everything. Like, everybody deserves compassion. People only abuse because they're wounded. And what do they need? More love and compassion. Like this was my motto and how I lived my life. A lot of that was instilled in the church. A lot of that was also instilled in the spiritual community. And, it is the natural way of someone with a good and loving and empathic heart. So this one gets really tricky. Compassion is beautiful. Like, loving people and forgiveness are such profoundly beautiful virtues. And I wish that we lived in a world where that wasn't taken for granted and manipulated so much. With these particular kinds of people, forgiveness and compassion is not, it's not taken as the divine gift of grace that it is. Okay, when you're dealing with these kinds of predators and abusers, those people use compassion as permission. They use it as permission to continue abusing. They don't understand forgiveness as like, okay, you did this, you caused harm, but I'm offering you this beautiful gift of grace. Like, they don't value it like that. It's just a permission slip to continue doing the same thing. Like, it is kind of like training them that they can just keep doing it because they'll be forgiven again. I know it's weird to think about it that way, especially if that's not how you operate. It's really hard to wrap your mind around that kind of psychology or that kind of thinking. But once you understand that certain people with certain personality disorders, these predatory disorders, it becomes easier to see like why having too much compassion or being too forgiving can be problematic. And again, it can feel like a huge loss of innocence, but it's an important one. So compassion is amongst the most beautiful of virtues, but it can often be misappropriated in conscious or spiritual or religious circles. More often than not, in these cult-like groups, the perpetrator ends up receiving more compassion than the victim. So usually what happens is psychological abusers have a calm way about them. They are able to inflict agony and pain on other people, and they receive energy or power from it, right? Like, this is, again, like a vampiric dynamic. And so when you see somebody making another person crazy, abusing them to make them crazy, like, the abuser is going to feel inflated. They're going to feel calm. They are actually getting high from it. Meanwhile, the victim is over there going batshit crazy, losing their shit, freaking out, melting down. It's not pretty. So it is much easier for groups of people looking from the outside in, and they see the abusive person just like calm and steady with, their like highly rehearsed charade of charisma around them. Like, they look all put together, like they're good. It's so easy for them to point and be like, yeah, she's the problem. I'm the victim. And even if they were to come out and say like, yeah, I did this terrible thing, but, here's my villain story. We think a lot about these movies, and we're so fascinated with a villain story. Like, well, how did the villain turn out that way? What was their past like? Like, we want to understand. And yes, it is extremely fascinating. I enjoy a good villain backstory as well. Because I have this huge special interest in psychology now. But we have to understand that if we focus too much there, we are giving the perpetrator and then the abuser more of our energy and more of our focus, and they often get more of our compassion. And I think a lot of that is because it's relatable to us. We all have shadow aspects, we all have narcissistic tendencies. And, you know, for all of us, we have a hard time looking at that stuff. Like, it's not easy stuff to look at. And I think whenever we see someone coming out, we have compassion for them because, you know, we might see aspects of that in ourselves, and that might want compassion as well. I don't know. I'm just theorizing here, but I think that might be why we're more drawn in and fascinated with, you know, a person's villain story. But what that does is that it takes energy off of the victim. You know, it's like more energy to the narcissist, which they're feeding off of anyway. And then you have the person who's been abused who is literally losing their mind, because narcissistic abuse will have you doing that. And the behaviors that come out of a person when they're in that state they're volatile, they're very scary. And, you know, I think why that's so hard to look at is because, you know, part of us knows that, like, what would happen if we were that unhinged? Like, you know, it's like that self-reflective thing again. Like, I wouldn't want to end up in that state. That's very scary. So I'm going to turn my eye away from there and be like, yeah, I'm just going to, you know, shun this right away. And again, I think, you know, we also deny those wounded parts of ourselves and our wounded inner child, like, you know, parts what they call them are exiles. And seeing that externally, you know, we do the same thing to a person who is expressing those same conditions that we do to those parts of ourselves on the inside. So in a nutshell, basically what I'm saying is usually the perpetrators end up with our compassion and the victim ends up deprived of it. And on top of that, you know, in spiritual communities, there are negative emotions such as like anger and rage and sadness and being a victim. And, you know, a victim in these situations is going to be exhibiting all of those, which is also against spiritual dogma. So one of the most ironic things about this is that, you know, compassion is upheld as this most beautiful virtue, as it is. But most targets of narcissistic abuse are the most compassionate people you will meet. Their hearts are open, they forgive a million times. And that is in particular what makes them an easy target. Most, if not all, narcissists know that they will get away with so much more with an open-hearted, compassionate person than they will with like a difficult person with strong boundaries. So oftentimes a victim has already offered their abuser an overly generous amount of compassion for probably, you know, a series of abuse. These things happen, you know, over time. It's not just one thing that happens. Like, abuses are continual. And what happens is these victims, usually they keep forgiving, they keep, you know, turning the other cheek. So they've already given a massive amount of grace. But then at some point, it usually gets to a boiling point and the person just snaps. They can't take it anymore. And then that's when the issue comes into the group sphere, like in a community or into like a church group or whatever. And then there's usually like some accountability or like, oh, let's all like mediate around this. And at that point, the victim is not at all showing any compassion, even though that is what's, you know, preached in the group sphere. And then usually the group loyal to the abuser, especially if they're a leader, that person will be given the compassion and the victim will not receive it from the group for, you know, reasons we mentioned earlier in this video. And usually on top of that, the victim will be shamed for their own lack of compassion in the current circumstance. And the rest of the group probably has no idea the amount of compassion and grace that person gave their abuser leading up to this point. So yeah, in these situations, the very virtue of compassion is weaponized against the victim of abuse. So in the end, victims end up guilted for not summoning more compassion, while the abuser gets to continue to take any accountability. It's moments such as this where the turn your other cheek quote causes a great deal of damage. Okay, another one. They're just a reflection of you, or they're just a mirror. Okay, but when you look in the mirror, you see yourself, but it's reversed, right? So not everyone you encounter is a reflection of you. Some are projections. We project both positive and negative traits onto people around us all the time. And that all depends on our upbringing, our personal experiences, our biases, our fantasies, our hopes. A whole slew of like personal filters that we have will determine how we see another person. And yes, it's true. Some people reflect things that we subconsciously cannot stand about ourselves, and that's very triggering to us. Some people also reflect really beautiful things that we love about ourselves, and we love that. But the whole reflection trope should never be used as a blanket statement, because it simply isn't always true. The hall of mirrors and projections that we daily walk through as human beings are so nuanced. It's so much more complex and nuanced than any of us can even wrap our own minds around, much less contain in a simple platitude like everyone is a reflection of you. So this one also wrongly places blame back on the victim and lets the abuser dodge any accountability. So triangulation is another thing that we see that is problematic for victims of abuse. When a leader of a spiritual group or even a member is reacting against accountability, they will triangulate with other loyal members of the organization in order to gang up on the abused. Obviously, this further traumatizes the victim, and I think we've all seen this happen in one way or another. A narcissist is known for their circus of flying monkeys, and they will deploy them. It's a little bit more extreme than normal in these spiritual organizations. I mean, you can see the same thing as at a job where, there's seniority that dictates how much money you're going to have, like your position, your quality of life, what kind of tasks you do. So flying monkeys are more prominent, right? Everyone in these little societies wants to gain favor with the leaders so that they can have the most amount of perks, the highest pay. And when you're dealing with a spiritual group, you like it goes even deeper, because you're talking about your soul and your connection with God. And there is nothing more convicting than that. There's nothing more deep and resonant than your connection with the divine. And so, usually people will become flying monkeys easily because they are worried about, like, well, if this person is assigned to be my go-between between me and God, like this pastor or the spiritual leader is my connection to God, which, unfortunately, so many of these systems are set up that way. People are going to be highly likely to become a flying monkey if, their leader is engaging in abuse, because there's an inherent fear there that if I believe that this person is abusive and I reject them for it, or if I defy them or stand up against them for it, then how is that going to affect my relationship with God? And you might not even be thinking this outright. It's a subconscious fear in the background. This is something that I had to, similar things I had to unwire in my own subpsyche, after coming out of the church, and, just other like social hierarchy norms, like understanding this primal way that we operate. Like we're not literally thinking these things out, but it's what's going on in the background. And it's why this stuff is so pervasive. And it's why it's so hard to see, is because it is subconscious. But once you're privy to how these things work and what is actually motivating people behind the scenes, even behind the scenes of their own cognition, you can get a better grasp at why what's actually going on and why it's going on. So yeah, that's why we see so many people like in the cult group come to rescue the abuser versus, supporting and holding the victim. And it's a devastating thing to witness, and it's even a more devastating thing to experience. So if you have undergone this or are experiencing this in your life, I want you to know that you're not crazy. You're not alone. It is probably a really good idea for you to step out of that community. These kinds of dynamics are incredibly hard to overcome. People are not easily convinced. You might end up just running yourself into the ground and digging yourself a deeper grave by trying to get someone or your peers to understand and validate what you experienced. These complexes run so deep, and like I said, they're even subconscious, and people will deny them at all costs. So usually your best bet is to step away from the group or the organization. The most important thing for you to understand if you're experiencing this is that you will not lose your connection to God, your connection to spirit, or any other thing that you think you are going to lose by walking away from this group of people. You're not going to lose it. The only thing you are going to lose by staying there is your connection with yourself, and actually your connection with God. Your connection with spirit is between you and spirit. Your relationship with God is between you and God. And yes, having community to share those values with is very important. But if you are in a situation like this, these people do not share your values. They might claim to. But if you are experiencing abuse in any of these communities, I'm so sorry. Like, it's really important to get through the cognitive dissonance of what people say and how they act to others on social media, what they proclaim, and then what they're actually doing. A lot of times we can be easily trauma bonded in these groups, just like in a romantic relationship where there is a great divide between what is being shown over here and then what is being shown over here. Our brains have a really hard time connecting to extremes, and then we can get stuck. So first of all, just validate yourself that there is a great divide here. And that means that you're not actually experiencing what these people claim. And what these people claim and how they brought you in was in alignment with your values, but what is going on is not. So waking up and noticing that is, the first part of your own liberation. And if this is you, I'm very sorry that you are experiencing this. I hope that you get the help and the support that you need. And I hope this video was educational and helpful and supportive to you. Okay, be well, and you've got this, and you're so loved. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next video.